our upper level membership level, and he has been a major supporter, a major friend. He's always there to give his advice and direction and of his time. You need to pick up his book. If you've not read his most recent book, pick that up. I think it's back there. John, do you have it with you? Yeah. Again, there's battlefield preservation has no better friend than John Maass, and neither do I. And I'd like to ask him to come up and give ours first song.
Okay, folks, one slight correction on yesterday. The reason Kevin wasn't there was because when he got up at 6 a.m. and saw that it was 21 degrees out, all of a sudden there were lots of meetings to go to. And Kirsten came up, and she was Kevin for the day, which I have to say was a much better looking Kevin. So we might have to go with that again next year, Scott, when we plan this.
That's all the time we have for John.
I want to thank others from the foundation too: Kirsten, Dan, Jack, Tammy for the logistical support and everything we've gotten from the foundation headquarters to put this on, but also all of you for coming. We've got a full room here today, as you can see, and that's good. So I am going to talk a little bit about to give an overview of the French and Indian War in a somewhat of a global context, and just to kind of familiarize folks with the general narrative before our other speakers get a little bit more focused. So when I was teaching at Ohio State, I used to ask as a trivia question, how long did the 7 Years' War last? And well, it was 9 years, so that was a trick question. I also used to ask the students, why were all the Civil War battles fought inside national parks? That was another one that used to trip them up. But I don't have any good ones today. But so we'll get right into the program here. So really, the French and Indian War, what we call the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, was really the last of four major European conflicts that spilled over into America. But in the French and Indian War is a little bit different because a lot of the genesis for the war actually started here in America and led to a larger conflict in Europe. But these three here, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War, you can see the years there. And the names in parentheses are what they're known as in a European context. And oftentimes you'll see these wars referred to as by the name of the treaty that ended the war as well. So some of them have several different names here. Various levels of participation in these wars by Americans, sometimes successful, sometimes not. The French and Indian War, however, had a very, very large participation rate of the colonies, particularly those in New England, New York, somewhat in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was a little bit different. They did raise provincial troops. There was no official militia in Pennsylvania because of the strong, the continuing influence of the Quakers there, but they were able to get around that with various sleights of hand, but also in creating provincial regiments. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. So these wars were fought all over the world, several times, in several instances, India, in the Philippines, North and South America, Hudson Bay, all over the place. So a very wide context for these. Okay, so this map kind of gives you an overview of where the British colonies were, which are in red, the Spanish colonies, which are kind of that light orange down at the bottom. And then, I don't really say French colonies all over the place. I think the French regarded Louisiana and what they called Lower Canada and Quebec as their colonies. The area that you see in blue that's out in what we would call the upper Midwest and into way up into the Canadian provinces weren't really colonies as far as huge populations, but they were areas dominated by French traders, fur traders, merchants, Indian traders. It was the French area of influence, but not all of that area was settled. The main part of the settlement in Canada was along the St. Lawrence River, basically from what we know today as Quebec all the way past Montreal, and that had a population only of about 70,000 inhabitants. That was far, far less than the British colonies, the 13 colonies that we know today. So the ability of the French to raise any kind of militia force or labor forces during the French and Indian War was very, very limited, financially too. Okay, so this map shows the major campaigns. So I'll go over them briefly while we have this map up here. Most of us know, based in Winchester here, the first one that we are going to hear about in much more detail coming up by Scott Patchen, which is the Washington's 1754 campaign out to the forks of the Ohio, and the attempt to capture the fort there, Fort Duquesne, which was built by the French. The area where you see Fort Duquesne, kind of on the left side of the map there, claimed by France, claimed by Virginia, and also claimed by Pennsylvania. In fact, Virginia claimed all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. So they had very ambitious goals. So that campaign ended. I don't want to steal any of Scott's thunder, but spoiler alert, it did not end well for our boy George. Okay? He had some trouble out there that we're going to hear a lot about. We heard a little bit about it yesterday, those of you who went on the Fort Frederick tour. As we heard last night from David Preston, Braddock's campaign, 1755. Now, the French and the British were not officially at war until 1756. And yet the British sent over two red-coated regiments, establishment regiments, the 44th and 48th, somewhat under strength. They were under strength with the expectation that when the regiments would land in Virginia, which they did at Hampton, wound up moving up to Alexandria, that Virginians would flock to the colors, flesh out these regiments that would be full strength, and George Washington could have told them, based on his experience, that that was not going to happen. They were just not going to be able to recruit that heavily. So we see the Braddock's campaign there. That ended in failures. We heard last night from David. And we will talk about some of the other campaigns there. You can see the Quebec campaign of 1759. Probably in addition to Braddock's campaign, probably the most famous. That was Wolfe's campaign to capture Quebec. The main battle was on the Plains of Abraham between the French and the British. The British wound up winning that battle. Wolfe and Montcalm, the French commander, both mortally wounded. So that also was a famous campaign. And of course, Louisbourg on the you can see on the top right there. That also was a successful British attempt as well. Now, there's some missing here. One, you can see Fort William Henry, that's famous for the Last Mohegans. That's one of the few examples of a story with Last of the Mohegans where the movie is actually better than the book. It's absolutely better than the book. Okay. Now, and I'm going to stress this a little bit more later in some of the slides, but initially the French were far more successful in their endeavors than the British. And things didn't really start to turn around until the tail end of 1758 and then 1759. Okay, the first, and again, I'm not going to talk too much about Scott's talk that's coming up, but I'm going to use this as an example to talk about how troops were raised in the colonies. So a lot of times you see in books and websites and other places that George Washington was the commander of the Virginia Regiment, which was part of the Virginia militia. So that's not really true. They did recruit from the militia, but the way the British colonies raised their troops is to raise regiments for certain campaigns or for certain durations, and those were called provincial troops. And theoretically, they had uniforms, they had full stands of arms, which meant a musket, a bayonet scabbard, a belt, and a belly box for cartridges. Different colonies had better success or less success than others. So if you've ever read Fred Anderson's book from the 80s, People's Army, I think it's the People's Army, he talks extensively about the Massachusetts troops, and he uses their letters home, explains how they were equipped very well and armed pretty well, whereas other colonies, for example, North Carolina, had a very difficult time doing that because of the backward type of economy that North Carolina had. It was a very, very weak colony, and did not really do that very well. Part of the problem also in raising troops for the colonies, which appears year after year after year, is their inability to pay for anything. The currency was literally worthless in North Carolina. They printed thousands of pounds of paper currency, and toward the end of the war, and the currency would be spent on the economy, and then people would be able to trickle down to the people which theoretically they could use to pay their taxes and pay other expenses. North Carolina was so roguish that the colony purposefully printed a lot of their currency in 1759 on very thin paper, knowing that it was going to wear out and that it could not be used to pay the taxes, because then the colony wouldn't have to redeem the currency. When the money came in, it was kind of like a loan on the population, and the theory was that when it all came in for taxes, that money would literally be burned in a pile, and then the money would be paid off. But if nobody could bring in that money, then the state really didn't have to pay anything. So does that sound familiar with? Anyway, it was all the legislature's fault. So these regiments were raised for specific purposes, and in 1754, and in latter years through the early 1760s, Virginia and other colonies raised regiments for specific purposes, such as the Fort Necessity campaign in 1754, Braddock's expedition to the forks of the Ohio, Forbes' expedition in 1758 through Pennsylvania, and also garrisoning the numerous forts in Virginia from the Potomac all the way to the Mayo River, which is on the border of North Carolina. And Washington was the commander. He served from 1754 until the end of the Forbes campaign in 58. And after the Forbes campaign was successful, and the regiment was actually the two regiments in Virginia, after his regiment that he commanded personally was disbanded, he goes back to Mount Vernon, takes up his role as a burgess for the colony of Virginia, and pursues Martha. So they actually wind up getting married in January of 1759, within about 60 days after he got off of service. So that's what his experience was. Okay, again, Braddock's defeat. This was again, note the year. This is before the France and Britain were really at war, and it's interesting that the British felt confident enough to send two regiments over to the colonies for this expedition. Now, they didn't exactly announce it in the newspapers in London. We're sending two regiments from London to America to kick France's butt, right? They didn't do that. It was supposed to be to garrison the colonies against Indian attacks, but the total focus was going out to the forks of the Ohio. So these two regiments, as I mentioned, they landed initially at Hampton and then were shipped up to Alexandria. Almost all of the activities that were on the frontier before, which would originate in Alexandria, and then supplies and troops typically moved over the Blue Ridge to Winchester, through the mountains to Fort Cumberland, which was really the last place that it was safe to have a depot and to have troops there, store weapons and supplies before moving out to the forks of the Ohio. And again, this obviously ended disastrously for the British, and opened the frontiers of Pennsylvania, Western Maryland, everything west of the Blue Ridge, to Indian attacks sponsored by the French out of Fort Duquesne. Also at this time, the French did have some small fortifications in what we know of today as Alabama, and some French, I don't want to call them advisors, but some French officers and a few troops were seen on the frontier of North Carolina and South Carolina as early as late 1755. So there was some activity in that area, but nothing near what it was up in the northern theater. Okay, so it wasn't just, and we had this question last night, and David mentioned this was one of just 4 campaigns, the Braddock campaign, but there was an attempt the British to seize what the French knew as Acadia, which the British then called Nova Scotia. And British Colonel William Johnson was victorious at the Battle of Lake George, New York, the southern end of Lake George, where Fort William Henry was. That was a British victory. The French had established forts at Crown Point and Ticonderoga, which they called Carillon. And the Crown Point fortifications that they had were known as Fort St. Frederick. Those both figured prominently in the war and also in the Revolutionary War, in Burgoyne's campaign of 1777 leading up to Saratoga. So there were some victories in 1755, but really Braddock's campaign was so disastrous and so notorious as a complete defeat that it tends to overshadow the other events a little bit here. Okay, so in 1756, that's Montcalm on the right. He was the French military commander, not the governor of New France, but the French military commander. And the declaration of war came in 1756. So now all the gloves were off, and the war eventually would become a world war. So, and a lot of that was naval actions, but the British and the French had a strong interest in India for commerce and their products, and also the Philippines. There was the Dutch were in the Philippines, the Spanish in the Philippines. Many of those actions off the coast of Africa. So this really was a world war when you include North America and part of South America as well. The West Indies. The West Indies, once these two, in fact, one of the reasons why the treaty was not signed until, the war wasn't declared until 1756, is because both France and Great Britain had enormous wealth coming from the West Indies, the Sugar Islands. And they wanted to allow enough time for the ships that were known to be coming back from the West Indies to get back to both France and Great Britain. Excuse me. So it wasn't immediately announced, but once that was announced, then the West Indies became a major focus of the war, as did India. Here you can also see in August of 1756, the French captured Fort Oswego. There would actually be 2 forts there, Fort Ontario and Fort Oswego. And that's where the red dot is there that you see. That can be reached That can be reached by the British by the Hudson River to Albany, and then just north of Albany, I'm sure many of you have been in this area, you can take the Mohawk River to the vicinity of Fort Stanwix. There's a fairly short portage for bateaux and canoes that you can take there, and then on to Lake Ontario. And this was a very strategic spot. The shipping on Lake Ontario was very limited to small ships. Now there were some shipping that were sailing ships with cannons, but there were no 44-gun man of war on Lake Ontario. So in order to secure the lakes, the French had established long before the French-Indian War Fort Niagara, which you can see on the left side of the map. And any attempt to get supplies to the forts west of the Appalachian from the French either had to come up the Mississippi River, which was very difficult at that time, or to take the St. Lawrence River to Lake Ontario, portage around Niagara, and then onto Lake Erie, and then down to Fort Duquesne and some of the other forts there. And some historians have pointed out that the British might have done just as well to have attacked Fort Oswego in 1755 rather than Fort Duquesne, because if they captured Oswego and maintained Oswego later in the war, they could have choked off the supplies, and Fort Duquesne would have essentially died on the vine. And others have argued that it would have been far easier to take those rivers and make one portage than to cut 2 different roads and 3 different campaigns and go over the mountains and rivers and what have you. It's a what if. They didn't do it, so but this Fort Oswego fell in '56. Montcalm made very good tactical decisions and made quite a name for himself in this campaign. Okay, 1757. This was the famous Fort William Henry, the basis of most of the story of Last of the Mohegans. That is an original tinted map of the south end of Lake George. You can see I have the red arrow. The fort's a little hard to make out in there. You can see the fort there. And as you know, how many of you have seen Last of the Mohegans, the movie? Okay. So I don't usually like to talk about the movies and history talks, especially The Patriot. Don't get me started. We'll do that. We'll do that next year. I'll talk an hour about The Patriot. But this was a major French expedition that was waterborne, and the expedition started on the St. Lawrence. The marshalling area was in the Montreal area, and this is a kind of an unusual instance in North America where the rivers and lakes run from south to north. So off of the St. Lawrence, the Richelieu River connects the St. Lawrence with the bottom, meaning the north of Lake Champlain. And so the troops had to go by boat and then do a portage at Fort Ticonderoga onto Lake George, and then down to the southern end of the lake, which you see at the very, very bottom here. And the French landed a little bit off this map on the lake, off of the top left. Burgoyne landed at virtually the exact same place in 1777. But here in 1757, 20 years beforehand, the French army landed. They brought siege artillery with them. Fort William Henry was a log fort, not a stone fort. And after a while of this bombardment, the British under Monroe wound up surrendering the fort. Now, there was a lot of controversy at the time because Monroe was trying to get help from another fairly strong British fort on the top of the Hudson River, Fort Edward, which was at the bottom of the portage road. There was a road that led from the Fort William Henry here down to the Hudson. It's about 18 miles long, I believe, to Fort Edward, and then you could take the Hudson all the way down to New York City and Hudson and the Bay, the New York Harbor. They did not get those reinforcements, and they were forced to surrender. The famous incident follows this, where the British march out of the fort with women, families, camp followers, and the French Indians went into the fort, massacred some of the soldiers that were in the hospital, massacred some of the column that was moving. The French allowed the British to evacuate the fort and move to Fort Edward, mostly because they did not have the logistics and the supplies to support bringing all those prisoners back to Canada. The Canadian economy just simply could not handle that. And so the famous incident where they massacred some of the people, the soldiers and civilians moving off. If you remember the movie, this is where Daniel Day-Lewis takes his girlfriend and leaves, right? He and Lady Mary, I think it is, I don't know. Why am I talking about the movie so much? So anyway, another French victory. So 1757, we have another French victory. We have Oswego. The British have been destroyed at the forts of the Ohio. So things are looking pretty good for them. And yet things start to go wrong in 1758 also. And the famous expedition of this year was against Ticonderoga. The French had strengthened Ticonderoga, and how many of you have been to Fort Ticonderoga? Okay, good number. So as you know, who have seen it, the fort is situated overlooking the bottom of the south end of Lake Champlain. And for the infantry and the troops, there was a forward position of the French lines, the French main lines, which you can still see if you go there today. So most of the infantry was out in very well dug-in lines that they chopped down trees to create abattis. So that's where you chop down trees and drag them into position where the log end, the trunk end is toward your lines, and the branches are out toward the enemy lines to make it difficult for them to maintain any kind of orderly attack against any enemy lines. And that's the French position was very well. The British collected. It's hard to tell exactly how many there were, but roughly 12,000 men. Now, just imagine if the Lake George area in 1757, 58, with no towns up in that area to speak of, and trying to get 12,000 men, plus horses, plus carts, plus artillery, plus supplies, up into a wilderness area in order to move largely by boat from Fort William Henry area on the south end of Lake George up to the north end of Lake George in the wilderness like that. It was a tremendous logistical feat just to get there. Many of these troops of the 12,000 were provincial troops that we talked about earlier, and particularly from New England, Massachusetts, and New York. When there was a large encampment at the southern end of Lake George and also Albany, and the provincials wound up having a lot of trouble with the regulars, and they would not be brigaded, they refused to be brigaded with regular British troops because they were afraid of falling under British Army regular discipline. They did not want to be subject to 500 lashes for infractions and other kind of punishments like that. Particularly in Massachusetts and Connecticut, the provincial troops literally signed contracts of employment, or in this case deployment, to guarantee their rights, what they were entitled to. How much food, how much pay. If they were made to build roads or anything else, they got extra pay. They were only to serve under their own officers. If they were brigaded with anybody, meaning if several regiments were put together, it had to be with other provincial regiments. And that brigade had to serve under a provincial officer, not a red coat officer. So it was a very contentious thing for quite a while on the campaign. But the commander, Major General James Abercrombie, he was able to abide by those rules that were set down. He didn't like it, of course, but was able to marshal this entire force and get to Ticonderoga and take up positions surrounding the French lines that I just mentioned, where their infantry was. And the French forces only had about 3,000, 4,000, closer to 3,000 at the time, mostly made up of French regulars and what they call French militia. Their militia was largely better trained than what militia in the 13 colonies, the British colonies was. It's not quite apples to apples. The British attacked mainly head on. The way that, if you know Fort Ticonderoga, the fort itself sits on an elevated kind of neck or a promontory that has water on three sides of it, basically, between the creek that runs from Lake George to Lake Champlain. And so the position of the French went in a circle around a semicircle on the land part of it, and it was narrow, and so Abercrombie could not get all 12,000 troops to attack at one time because the terrain was too narrow. The British, mostly the Highlanders, you can see that image on the right there, attacked the French positions. It was an absolute disaster for the British. Abercrombie failed to utilize part of the left flank where Connecticut provincials were, sent the troops in several frontal assaults on the French lines, and as you can see, as I mentioned here, there were 2,000 British casualties, and Abercrombie was forced to retreat. So here again, as late as the summer of '58, another British disaster. Okay, so now it started to turn around on July 25th when Louisbourg was captured. Louisbourg was a very strong position in Canada at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, and General Wolfe was before his campaign against Quebec in 1759. He was involved in this expedition as well, and after a siege of the fort and a bottling up of the harbor by the British Navy, Louisbourg surrendered. So this was really good news for the British. And then shortly afterwards, the French surrendered Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario, which is where the St. Lawrence River begins on the lake. So two more victories, and of course, 1758 November was the Forbes campaign. So I'll talk a little bit about the Forbes campaign here. This was a campaign that Washington, I think for those of you who were at the Fort Frontenac yesterday, heard a little bit of this. This was the third attempt to capture Fort Duquesne. And it was led by a colonel of the 17th Regiment of Foot, John Forbes. He was sent to America to lead this and was given theater rank of brigadier general. So he was known as General Forbes while he was here in America. He was extremely ill. He arrived in Pennsylvania in April of 1758, already ill, And by the time he got halfway across Pennsylvania, the only way he could travel was in what we would call a stretcher. In the 18th century, they would call it a litter, 2 poles with a blanket in between them, where 2 of the poles were attached to a horse in the front, and the other end of the poles were attached to another horse in the back, and he literally had to ride kind of lying down like that. And you can imagine how comfortable that was going over the mountains in western Pennsylvania, river crossings, things along those lines. Forbes was, the controversy was, Forbes employed a lot of provincials in this expedition, about 2,500 provincials from North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and a very small contingent from Delaware. And those regiments were all brigaded together and led by Colonel George Washington. Forbes was a lot more interested in learning American type of tactics and favored that. So the controversy was Washington wanted Forbes to use Braddock's Road in order to attack Fort Duquesne. Now, I've seen it incorrectly in articles and books that Washington intended Forbes to pack up in Philadelphia, go down the Delaware Bay, enter the Chesapeake, go to Alexandria, and duplicate Braddock's route. What Washington wanted Forbes to do is to move his army along established roads out to what was called initially Raystown, which turned into Fort Bedford, which is now Bedford, Pennsylvania on US 30. And from Fort Bedford, it's less than 60 miles directly south to the Potomac River at Fort Cumberland, which is where Braddock stays the last part of his campaign. So Washington and others, mostly Virginians, wanted the campaign to move down to Cumberland 60 miles and then go out on Duquesne. Why did he want to do that? Because Washington and his guys and Virginians in the Ohio Company and other land speculation companies wanted to have Braddock's Road improved, so all the commerce from the forks of the Ohio and the Ohio Country would come down through Virginia and Alexandria, and they would get a lot more money that way. Washington wrote to Forbes duplicitously, arguing that the Forbes Road route was going to be 50 miles longer than the other way. It was only 19, and he also contacted other British officers, other governors, the governor of Virginia, to the point where Forbes really had to smack him down in writing and say, no, we're going through Pennsylvania. So Forbes's route, and long story short, Forbes's route was through Carlisle, across the Susquehanna River at what is now Harrisburg, and out to Fort Loudon, Pennsylvania, and on to what we just talked about as Bedford. And the advance element of most of the troops, not all the supplies and wagons, was commanded by a Swiss-born officer named Henry Bouquet. He was an officer in the Royal American Regiment, which was, as the name implies, raised in America. They raised 4 battalions. Ironically, almost all the officers were foreign-born. But Bouquet was a very well-educated, very qualified officer, and he led most of the advanced elements, including Washington and his provincials. And Forbes trained a lot of his men in this forest type of warfare. So the route from Bedford, Pennsylvania, goes over to Fort Ligonier, which the Pennsylvania Regiment built, initially improved by the British, and that's only 50 miles from Fort Duquesne. Now, in September of 1758, Forbes sends Major James Grant of the 77th Highlanders on a recon of Fort Duquesne, because very few British officers had laid eyes on Fort Duquesne. They didn't know how strong it was, they didn't know how many people were there, how many Indians, how many French. But for a recon, Forbes had, all told in his army, including garrisons, from Carlisle all the way to Fort Ligonier, he had 6,000 troops. That was 3 times bigger than Braddock's expedition. But a lot of those troops kind of whittled away because they were needed for garrisons. But still, at Ligonier, he had a little over 3,000 men and sent a recon of 850 men. That's not a recon. Okay, that is not a recon. There's no way they were going to get anywhere near the fort. It's like taking Cub Scouts into the woods and expecting to see wildlife. You know what I mean? No chance. No chance. So so Grant gets to almost Duquesne, into the heights around it, and starts having the bagpipes blow and the drums rattle, and they form up in linear formation, and he was attacked. They lost 325 of the Highlanders alone. Grant was captured. And so this word gets back, survivors get back to Fort Ligonier. By this time, Forbes gets to Ligonier. It's in the middle of October. They're way out in Pennsylvania, and it's getting very close to the point of no return as far as winter weather. And Washington, then Fort Ligonier is attacked in November of 1758. They're still at Ligonier. By this time, they're cutting it really close if they're not going to be too late. The French attack the Washington provincials, capture 3 French soldiers and interrogate them, and say that, well, Ligonier is under strength and very few Native American warriors are there. So Forbes changes his mind. Instead of going back east, which he had decided the day before, they go ahead and attack the fort, but before they get there, the French blow it up, and the British come in and take it. They establish a small fort for 220 men, a little bit upstream from the Monongahela River, to house that many troops over the winter, and then begin work on Fort Pitt, on the ruins of Duquesne the following spring. So 3 big victories in 1758. And 1759 is known as the Annus Mirabilis, that is the year of miracles. And so for the British, the French didn't call it that. That was the British word. So you can see the various actions here. They captured the French island of Guadeloupe. That was actually negotiated back in the treaty at the Martinique was too at the end of the war. The British did take Fort Ticonderoga. The French had basically evacuated it, and the British took that, secured that area. British took Fort Niagara, a key place where now the French could no longer supply any of their locations out in the Midwest or down the Ohio. August 1st, 1759, the Battle of Minden, that's in Germany, what's now Germany today. That was a key victory for the British against the coalition army, primarily the French. They won that battle, which on the continent. That's actually the battle where Lafayette's father was killed. And if you know anything about the General Phillips of Saratoga campaign and the Southern campaign against Richmond, he was at that battle as well. And the main one, though, you'll see there is September 13, 1759, the Battle of Quebec, which I mentioned earlier, where Wolfe and his forces also cutting it close in September because they were running close on not being able to get resupplied on the St. Lawrence because it would have frozen over. So important victory there. And then there was the naval battle of Quiberon Bay right off the coast of France, crippled France's ability to resupply Quebec and protect their possessions in the West Indies. Okay, 1760, the French actually didn't give up on Quebec, despite the many books leave this section off. They actually besieged Quebec themselves, and the British garrison was able to hold on, but just barely. Part of it was the French had no real way of getting any more supplies or any more troops up the St. Lawrence once the British had captured Quebec and had naval forces at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. So Montreal fell as well. That was it on Canada. There were 3 campaigns against the Cherokees in South Carolina, 1759, 1760, 1761. That took place in kind of in the Appalachian Mountains and the backcountry of South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, what's now eastern Tennessee. Those eventually were British victories, but in the 1760 campaign, the same Major Grant, who enjoyed bagpipe music while Indians were around, he actually led that expedition and was defeated in far western North Carolina, if you know that area, near Franklin, North Carolina. All right, the Treaty of Paris. So what was the outcome? The Treaty of Paris, the French lost all their possessions east of the Mississippi River except New Orleans. All possessions west of the Mississippi were given to the Spanish, and they lost Canada. They got back Martinique and Guadeloupe, the 2 valuable sugar islands. Those 2 sugar islands were more valuable than all of Canada. And I think that David could probably help me out on this. I think it was Voltaire that declared Canada a few acres of snow or something along those lines. They did not want Canada. They were going to keep the sugar islands. Okay, so the British came out very well. And this led the seeds of the coming of the revolution. It's a long and twisted road. It's not a straight road, but we will be hearing a little bit more about that later today. But the main effect was the Americans, especially in the backcountry, and the New York frontier, the New England frontier. They no longer had the French in Canada that were a threat. And there were also no more French Canadians to give the Indians presents, such as muskets, gunpowder, and musket balls. So this really changed the equation of the American frontier, which is probably the biggest result of the war, the biggest consequence of the war. Okay, I know that was fast. I'll give you extra time on the test. Because it was fast, okay? Do we have any questions on any of that? We're going to get into some of these aspects much more closely as we have additional speakers today. Any questions? Yes, sir?
What was the population of the colonies at this point?
All colonies, approximately 1.2 million in 1760.
And how many people did the French have?
70,000 along the St. Lawrence. Yes, sir?
Why do you think the French were so less prone to emigrate to the New World than the British?
So the French, they did not have the population push to get out of France or any of its possessions that the British did in both Northern Ireland, the major cities. The land up there was not as hospitable as much of America was. It was only able to be resupplied for 7, at best 8 months out of the year. There was a lot of logistical problems, and really their focus, there weren't Quakers coming over, there weren't Puritans coming over to France, there weren't Huguenot refugees. Slavery was not illegal in New France, but there was no slave-based agriculture up there. So their main effort was commercial. It was trade, Indian trade, and animal fur. That's really what they were doing. It was a commercial interest rather than having these other factors. Yes, sir.
Mark, At this period in history, were there enough German immigrants coming into the valley in western Pennsylvania to be a factor on either side in the war?
So about German immigrants in the backcountry, there were German immigrants, many of which had come before 1750 in the Shenandoah Valley, the Moravians in backcountry North Carolina and what's now Winston-Salem. Of course, plenty of Germans in the kind of the Lancaster, Bethlehem, that country west of. Mostly the backcountry was filled with Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, all the way into South Carolina, North Carolina, and obviously Western Pennsylvania as well. Yes, sir?
Last question.
Oh, can you talk a little bit about William Pitt's involvement in maybe
Yes.
the turnaround for the British?
Yes. So part of the reason the Annus Mirabilis came in 1759 was because in 1758 William Pitt the Elder became the prime minister. That's not what they didn't use that term in the 18th century. He became primarily responsible for waging war in North America, and he promised the colonies, which had been very, very stingy in providing money. Particularly North Carolina, that's where I did almost all my grad work earlier. He told them that he would, just the southern colonies alone, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, he promised them that he would reimburse them their expenses up to 50,000 pounds sterling. All of a sudden, they had no trouble filling the regiments at that point. Okay, the bounties were promised in either land or coin. They could pay, they could supply, they could contract, and that was throughout the colonies. And it was his decision to appoint finally Sir Geoffrey Amherst as the commander in America, because the other commanders, Abercrombie, Loudon's very famous, as we all know from every town in Virginia has a Loudon Street, and there's like 14 Fort Loudons all over the place in French and New York. No, those guys didn't get the job done. Bradstreet. So between that new emphasis on the finances and the capable commander of Sir Geoffrey Amherst, that really turned the tide, but it also made for an incredible amount of debt the British had at the end of the war. Okay, I'm done.
Another round of applause for John.
We're going to take a 15-minute break, grab some coffee, water, use some facilities, what have you. We do have a little bit of a crisis, I need to let you know. You know, we are the Battlefields Foundation. A large part of what we do is seizing control of land and holding on to it. I just learned up here in talking to my chairman that he's a direct descendant of the representative of the French king, and so I'm a little concerned about his ability to seize and hold land. But at any rate, we'll work that out in the next break. We have a 15-minute break, and we'll be back here at 10 o'clock.